Jamal's small hands shook as he walked into the courtroom, the weight of the accusations against him pressing on his tiny shoulders. At just 7 years old, he found himself in a place no child should ever be: a trial accused of domestic abuse. His adoptive parents, seated across the room, described him as violent and out of control. They said he hit them during arguments, threw things in anger, and couldn't be trusted. But the truth was more complicated. Jamal didn't deny that he had acted out, but his reasoning was heartbreakingly simple. He was scared. Over the years, Jamal had been shuffled between different homes, each time hoping to find a family that would keep him. Instead, he faced rejection, misunderstanding, and punishment every time he felt unwanted. His fear turned into frustration, and his frustration turned into anger. His new adoptive family, though kind at first, quickly grew impatient with his behavior. To them, Jamal's emotions seemed like a problem they didn't want to solve. Clutching a worn-out sketchbook to his chest, Jamal felt like it was the only thing in the world that truly belonged to him. Inside, the pages were filled with drawings he made over the years, some bright and happy, others dark and full of swirling shapes that seemed to mirror how he felt inside. The sketchbook was his escape, a place where he could tell his story without using words. As he stepped into the courtroom, the weight of everyone's eyes made his heart pound. He felt small, like he was shrinking with each step closer to the stand. The room was cold and intimidating, filled with strangers who looked at him like he was a problem to solve rather than a boy in pain. Jamal didn't understand all the legal terms being thrown around, but he knew one thing for certain: no one here believed him. Sitting at the table with his caseworker worker, Jamal tried to focus on the drawings he'd done earlier that morning. One page caught his eye, a picture of a woman and a little boy sitting under a tree. He remembered drawing it years ago, though he couldn't quite remember why. All he knew was that looking at it made him feel safe, like the woman in the picture had once been very important to him. When the judge entered the room, Jamal barely glanced up at first, but then, as she called his name, something made him lift his eyes. His heart stopped there. She was the woman from his drawing. The memories came rushing back all at once. A soft voice singing him to sleep, the smell of lavender and the warmth of someone holding him close. Jamal's breath caught in his throat, and before he could stop himself, he whispered, "That's my mom, Judge Sarah Reynolds." Entered the courtroom like she always did, calm, composed, and ready to make difficult decisions. She had seen many heartbreaking cases in her career, but she prided herself on her ability to remain professional no matter what. Her reputation for fairness and compassion was well known, but today she felt an unusual sense of unease. She couldn't put her finger on why. When her eyes landed on the small boy seated at the defendant's table, Sarah, he felt a strange jolt in her chest. His face seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. She brushed the thought aside. After all, children's cases were common, and it wasn't unusual for emotions to cloud her judgment. "Jamal Harris," she said, her voice steady at the sound of her voice. The boy looked up for a moment. Their eyes met, and Sarah felt her breath hitch. The boy's expression shifted from nervousness to something she couldn't quite describe. Recognition, perhaps, but that didn't make sense. She had never met this child before. Jamal's heart raced as he stared at her, the memories flooding his mind were so vivid that it was like he'd stepped back in time. He remembered her smile, the way she took him in at night, and the song she used to hum when he was scared. There was no doubt in his mind this was her. This was the woman who had once been his mother. Suddenly, Jamal whispered, "That's my mom." The words were soft, but the room fell silent. The attorneys, the caseworker, and even Sarah froze. Sarah's heart sank, and her professional demeanor slipped. For just a second, she blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Jamal's eyes filled with tears. He pointed to her and said more loudly, "You're my mom. I remember you. You used to sing to me." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sarah's initial reaction was Disbelief she couldn't let herself be, distracted by a child's mistaken memory. No matter how heartbreaking it was, Jamal. She said gently but firmly, "I think. You're confused, I'm your judge, not your mom." But Jamal shook his head, his grip on the sketchbook tightening. He reached inside, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. Carefully, he pulled out a crumpled drawing and held it up for her to see. Sarah stared at the picture. It was a child's drawing of a woman and a boy under a tree holding hand. Something about it made her chest tighten. The details, the shape of the woman's face, the little boy's curls, the sunlight breaking through the branches, felt eerily familiar. Her fingers trembled as she took the drawing from him. "Where did you get this?" she asked her, voice barely above a whisper. Jamal looked at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "You gave me the crayons to draw it," he said, "before you left." For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. Her mind raced memories she had buried long ago, fighting their way to the surface. Could it be true? Could this boy really be the child she had lost so many years ago? The courtroom was tense as Jamal sat at the defendant's table, fidgeting with the corners of his sketchbook. His caseworker whispered something in his ear, but Jamal didn't hear her. His eyes were fixed on Judge Sarah Reynolds, who was busy speaking with the attorneys. The familiarity of her voice, her mannerisms, even the way she adjusted her glasses, it was all too much for Jamal to ignore. Before he could stop himself, he blurted out, "You're my mom." The room went silent. Heads turned toward Jamal, and even Sarah froze mid-sentence. She looked up, her expression shifting between confusion and surprise. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice careful but firm. Jamal's heart pounded as he tried to find the words to explain. "You're my mom," he repeated louder this time. "You used to sing to me at night. I remember you. You're her." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She glanced at the attorneys and caseworker, all of whom were staring at her expectantly. "Jamal," she said, her voice steady but carrying a note of uncertainty, "I think you're mistaken. I'm your judge, not your mother." But Jamal shook his head, his grip tightened on the sketchbook. "No, it's you. I remember you. Used to hum when I was scared, and you'd draw pictures with me." His small voice was full of conviction, but his trembling hands revealed just how nervous he was. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people whispered to one another. Sarah's professionalism told her to move on and address the matter later, but something in the boy's eyes made her pause. There was an intensity there, a longing that couldn't be faked. Jamal hesitated, then opened his sketchbook. He flipped through the pages, his small fingers brushing past drawings of stick figures and animals. Finally, he stopped at a worn, crumpled page. He pulled it out carefully and held it up for Sarah to see. "This," he said, his voice trembling. "I drew this when I was little. You gave me the crayons." Sarah's brow furrowed as she leaned forward to see the drawing. It was a simple picture of a woman and a boy holding hands under a tree. The boy had curly hair, and the woman had a kind smile written in a child's scrawl at the top of the words, "Me and Mom." Sarah felt her breath catch. Her hands trembled as she reached for the drawing, her mind racing. The details were strikingly familiar. The way the woman's hair was drawn in loose waves, the tree's branches reaching toward the sun, it all felt like a distant memory tugging at the edges of her mind. "Where did you get this?" Sarah asked softly, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. Jamal's eyes filled with tears. "You told me to draw it so we could hang it on the fridge," he said. "You said we'd keep it forever." Sarah sat back in her chair, the drawing still clutched in her hands. The courtroom felt suddenly too small, the air too heavy. Could this boy's claim really be true? The moment the courtroom recessed for a short break, Judge Sarah Reynolds hurried back to her chambers, the crumpled drawing still in her hand. Her mind raced as she replayed Jamal's words over and over. She knew it couldn't be possible, or at least it shouldn't be, but deep down she felt a growing sense of unease. Sitting at her desk, she opened Jamal's case file, scanning through the pages with trembling hands. When she reached the section with his full name and birth Date her heart sank, the name wasn't one she recognized, but the date of birth. March 15th hit her like a punch to the chest. She leaned back in her chair. Memories she had spent years burying, suddenly flooding her mind. Years ago, Sarah had been a struggling law student, barely scraping by. She was a single mother trying to raise a baby while juggling school and work her parents had disowned her when she got pregnant, and she had no one to turn to for help. As much as she loved her son, the weight of her circumstances had become unbearable. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights and empty bank accounts, Sarah made the hardest decision of her life. She kissed her 3-year-old son goodbye, promising him it was for the best. She placed him into foster care, believing it would give him a chance at a better life, a stable home, a future she couldn't provide. She had cried herself to sleep for months afterward, always wondering if she'd made the right choice. Over time, she forced herself to move forward, burying the pain and focusing on her career, but she never stopped thinking about him. She had no idea where he was or what had become of him, but she told herself he was safe and happy now. Sitting in her chambers, Sarah stared at the drawing Jamal had given her. It was impossible to deny the connection. She felt the memories he described, the details in the picture. It all lined up. Jamal was her son. The realization made her chest ache. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of the past crashed over her. How could this have happened? How could her son, the boy she gave up so he could have a better life, end up in a courtroom accused of such terrible things? Guilt and heartbreak consumed her as she thought of everything Jamal must have gone through in her absence. Sarah wiped her tears and took a deep breath. She couldn't change the past, but she could do something now. She knew what she had to do. The courtroom felt heavier than ever as the trial resumed. Sarah Reynolds, the once composed judge, now wore a vulnerable expression. Her eyes read from crying during the recess. She couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Jamal wasn't just another child in her courtroom. He was her child. As the attorneys resumed their arguments, Sarah's mind wandered back to the lullaby she used to sing when Jamal was a baby. It was their special song, one she hummed with whenever he was scared or upset. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her desk. She cleared her throat, her voice softer than usual. Jamal, she said, addressing him directly for the first time, do you remember the lullaby I used to sing to you? Jamal's head shot up. His eyes widened as a small, hopeful smile broke across his face. The one about the stars, he asked timidly. Sarah nodded, her voice shaking. Yes, can you hum it for me? Jamal hesitated, looking around the courtroom nervously, but then he closed his eyes and began to hum a soft, familiar tune. His voice was shaky at first, but grew steadier with each note. The melody was simple yet powerful, tugging at the heartstrings of everyone in the room. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. That lullaby was something she had never shared with anyone else. It was their song. Tears streamed down her face as she listened, memories of her baby boy flashing through her mind. She couldn't deny it anymore. This was her son. Without a second thought, Sarah stood up and stepped down from the bench. The courtroom was stunned, the murmurs growing louder, but Sarah didn't care. She walked straight to Jamal, who was now clutching his sketchbook tightly, his eyes brimming with tears. She knelt in front of him, her voice trembling. Jamal, she said softly, I'm so sorry I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Jamal's lip quivered as he whispered, you didn't forget me. Sarah shook her head, her tears falling freely. I could never forget you. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. She pulled him into a hug, holding him as tightly as she could. Jamal dropped his sketchbook and wrapped his arms around her neck, sobbing into her shoulder. The courtroom watched in stunned silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. I miss you so much, Jamal whispered through his tears. I miss you too, Sarah replied, her voice cracking, and I promise I'll never let you go again. The room was still except for the quiet sound of their sobs. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion, a mother and son finding each other after years of pain. In separation, the courtroom was buzzing with emotion after the reunion. The attorney's caseworkers and onlookers were all visibly moved by what had unfolded. Even the stern prosecutor wiped away a tear, clearly affected by the heartfelt moment. Child Services representatives requested a private meeting with Sarah and Jamal after the trial. Sarah willingly complied, explaining her history and the difficult decision she had made to give Jamal up. She spoke with raw honesty, describing the struggles of being a young single mother and the overwhelming guilt she carried every day since. Jamal listened, intently holding Sarah's hand the entire time. When it was his turn to speak, he looked up at the child services worker and said, "I don't want to go back to my other home. I want to stay with my mom." The child services team took their time, carefully reviewing the situation. Sarah provided proof of her stability, her successful career, her clean record, and her unwavering commitment to doing what was best for Jamal. She also submitted a heartfelt letter explaining how she had never stopped loving her son and how she wanted to make up for the time they had lost. Jamal's caseworker, who had initially seemed skeptical, softened after hearing both of their stories. "This isn't something we see every day," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But the bond between you two is undeniable. I believe Jamal deserves to be with his mother after a thorough investigation, and heartfelt testimony." Sarah was granted custody of Jamal. The judge overseeing the case, a colleague of Sarah's, emphasized how rare and special their reunion was. "This isn't just a legal victory," he said. "It's a testament to the power of love and second chances." When the decision was announced, Jamal jumped into Sarah's arms, and she held him close, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in years, they both felt a sense of peace as they walked out of the courthouse together, hand in hand. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over them. Jamal carried his sketchbook under one arm, and Sarah carried a promise in her heart to never let him feel alone again. At home, Sarah helped Jamal hang his drawings on the fridge, just as she had promised years ago. They spent the evening laughing, talking, and catching up on all the moments they had missed that night. As Sarah tucked Jamal into bed, he looked up at her and asked, "Are you really staying this time?" She kissed his forehead and smiled through her tears. "I'm never leaving again," she said. For the first time in a long time, both mother and son felt whole. Together they began to rebuild their lives, proving that love could truly heal even the deepest wounds.